Yá'át'ééh, my relatives. Hello, it's Mark Charles. Today is Thursday, June 27th. I'm sitting here with my second cup of coffee. It's a little bit later in the day. It's afternoon here, closer to 1 o'clock here in Washington or Washington, D.C., the traditional land of the Piscataway people. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. I want to honor them as the hosts of the land where I'm living. I just want to state how humble I am to be living, breathing, moving, and subsisting on these lands today. So, thank you, my Piscataway relatives. Mr. Phil Fox, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining today. George, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining today. It's good to have both of you. I'm sure there's many others who are jumping on as well. Thank you for joining me. This is my second cup of coffee that I'm broadcasting this week. I drink my second cup of coffee every day, but this is the first time I'm broadcasting this week. I'm going to be doing another one tomorrow. If you remember that tonight is the presidential debate, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. The debate is hosted by CNN, but it's going to be broadcast on several stations. Most of the network stations are going to be broadcasting it, as well as some of the public stations. I was trying to find the most comprehensive list I could about where it's going to be broadcast, and the most comprehensive list I could find was on CNET's website. So I'm going to post that link in the chat here. But the debate starts at 9 p.m. Eastern time, which is 6 p.m. Pacific time. It's going to be, obviously, it'll be on CNN. They're hosting the debate, but it'll also be on ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and several other networks as well. I think Telemundo is going to be broadcasting it. But anyway, there's a more comprehensive list on that CNET article I just posted. And I'm pretty interested in watching it. I'm excited to watch the debate tonight. Primarily because they don't have a live audience. It's in the studio, Trump, Biden, and the two moderators from CNN, and nobody else. And I think it's fascinating. I don't know. I'm assuming someone from the Biden campaign negotiated this, because if you want to have any chance of winning a debate with Donald Trump, you have to isolate him and get him away from his crowd, right? I mean, he absolutely plays to the crowd. He runs off the energy of the crowd. He very theatrical in the way he debates. And so, yeah, I think it will be fascinating to see how this debate plays out tonight. I also like the fact that they will have a mute button. So they're going to mute their mics when they're not being asked a question. So it will lessen their ability to interrupt while the other person is speaking. And so I'm actually interested. My daughter is also interested. So we're going to watch the debate tonight. And then tomorrow, I'm going to give some thoughts and some feedback on some of the questions, as well as how I think it went. So yeah, I'm going to be doing that live tomorrow on my second cup of coffee on Friday, June 28th. But anyway, I'm grateful that you could join me today. Thank you, my relatives, for joining me today. As you can see, the title of this second cup of coffee is called Indigenous Wisdom versus Scientific Knowledge. And a reason I didn't do a second cup of coffee on Thursday is because I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to talk about. As if you follow me on social media or you've been listening to my cups of coffee, you know I've kind of been devouring a bunch of books lately, and I've just been changing my paradigm regarding movement versus exercise. I've started barefoot running, and I'm actually doing my running as a spiritual discipline. So I'm not wearing my headphones. I'm just being out with nature. I'm actually running barefoot. And this week, something interesting happened. So I go running every morning, and I actually go to a track not too far from my house, and I run actually barefoot, not just with barefoot shoes, but run barefoot on the turf of the field where I go. And there's about a quarter mile of grass that I walk on before I get to the track. And so when I get to the grass, I wear my shoes out of the house and get to close to the field where I go. And then I actually go barefoot in the grass just to do some grounding. And especially when I moved here to DC from the Navajo Nation, from our lands between our four sacred mountains, one of the things I started doing more frequently was picking up the dirt in my hands as I watched the sunrise or as I prayed. And I did that because I live in DC. It's an urban jungle, right? I mean, every step you take is on pavement. Every lawn is manicured. Very rarely do you actually get to stand on the dirt of the ground that we're on. And so I began to do that just to touch the ground more and to be in contact with the land that I'm living on. And so now, this past probably 2 months, I've been literally walking barefoot about a quarter mile, 5 mornings a week when I go to do my running in the morning, and I actually walk on the grass barefoot. And you've heard me say this before, but DC actually gets more rain than both Seattle and Portland. The difference between us and Seattle and Portland is they get the bulk of their rain in a few months. And so they just have a long several months where they have a very dreary, it's overcast all the time, it's drizzling rain. Whereas DC, it's unusual to go more than 8 to 12 days without getting rain. It's usually not a massive storm. It usually rains for a few hours. It's often fairly light. Sometimes it can be heavier, but it rains fairly frequently here. And that keeps the ground very green. It keeps the plants growing. You wouldn't have to water your lawn here. Just things just grow, flowers bloom because we get so much rain. And this is throughout the season. We get this type of rain year long. We get this type of moisture coming into the ground. And so it's never cloudy just for days and days on end. And so there, people don't complain about the rain near as much, but we do actually get more rain than both Seattle and Portland does. And so because of that, and I would joke about this, especially soon after we moved here, is right, if DC goes more than 2 weeks without rain, people begin talking about drought. I'm like, you have no clue what drought is, right? I came from the high deserts of the Southwest, right? CNET, right? It's high desert. We can go months, sometimes even almost a year without rain, right? I mean, not a year, but a long time without rain. And so you don't know what drought is. But we have not had much rain. It's almost the end of June. We've had very little rain in the month of June. And I've been noticing it more than I usually notice it here because every morning I'm walking barefoot on the grass to do my running. And over the past 3 weeks, the grass has gotten drier and drier and browner and browner and pricklier and pricklier. And last night it started raining. And I've been watching the weather. We were expecting this storm to come, and so I knew it was going to rain. But when it rained last night, I actually went outside and just stood in the rain and let it just rain on me. And it wasn't very cold, and so I just stood there and let it rain on me. And I came back inside, and I said to Rachel, to my wife, I said, "This is the most grateful I've ever been for rain in DC." Again, it's only been about 3 weeks since our last real rainstorm, maybe 4, which in New Mexico or Arizona, that's nothing, right? I mean, you can go months without rain. And yet I found myself really missing the rain because every morning I was walking on the grass. I was watching it die. I was watching it get browner and browner and drier and drier. Every morning as I walked, I could feel it beneath my toes. And so when it rained last night, I was so happy. And then this morning when I walked to do my running, it was like walking on a plush carpet after walking on a hardwood floor for months, right? The grass was soft and pliable beneath my feet. The ground wasn't muddy, but it was wet and damp a little bit, not puddles, but just damp. And it felt wonderful just walking this morning. And so I'm doing my running as a spiritual discipline. I'm not training for a race. I'm not planning to run competitively. I'm not doing this as some other goal. I'm literally doing this as a spiritual discipline. And the same thing with the walking barefoot and the grounding is I'm trying to be more in touch with the ground that I'm living on and the ground that I'm making my life on right now. And so I actually really noticed the drought. And when the rain came last night, I felt this really intense gratitude for it, like I would feel when we lived back in the Navajo Nation, and we would wait, pray for weeks, for months for the rains to come. And it was always dry, it was always hot, it was always dusty, and we really welcomed the rains there. And I felt very similarly last night as the rains fell, and I actually stood out in the rain and just let it dump on my body. It wasn't raining that hard, but it was just nice to stand out and then to walk on the grass this morning. So anyway, I've been thinking about all these things, right? I've been reading these books, and several of the books, you've heard me talk about them before, that have had some impact on the health I'm doing, the way like my desire to wake up and sweat every morning came from reading this book, The 5 a.m. Club, which is not a book I recommend because it's not very well written, but it had some nuggets of wisdom in there, or some nuggets. It was knowledge for them, but it was really, it reminded me of some of our indigenous wisdom. And so I started going out and running, and as I ran every morning, I realized what it was doing for me mentally, what it was doing for me physically. And right, I've been watching the sunrise for 25 years now, many mornings on a regular basis, waking up, going and watching the sunrise. And I'm supposed to run, right? The tradition is you wake up and you run towards the east, and then you greet the sunrise with your prayers. But I wasn't running. I was just merely driving or walking to where I would watch the sunrise. And I was not incorporating the run into it. And when I started running, I realized what it was doing to me, not just mentally, but physically and spiritually. And that's actually what motivated me to listen to the wisdom of my elders and to make my running not a time when I have my headphones on listening to a podcast or running to music, but actually running with nothing in my ears, with nothing in my pockets, and just running even barefoot on the turf, and even touching the grass and the ground as much as I can, and treating that as part of my spiritual discipline. Another book you've heard me talk about recently is called Move Your DNA by Katie Bowman. It's a great book to help understand the science and the transition from running in shoes, wearing heeled shoes and cushioned shoes, to running barefoot, and how important that is, and what implications that has for your body. And her whole way she frames it and the way she talks about it, I talked about it. That book was a real paradigm shift for me in the way I thought about it. I actually took several days off of work and just focused as I read through that book and tried to think, okay, how can I allow this book to change my paradigm? And now I'm reading 2 more books, and I want to actually give you the books that I'm reading right now. The first book that I'm reading, I started this about a week ago, is called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She is a Potawatomi woman who is also a botanist. And I love her book because she's highly educated, and she is studied botany because of where she grew up and what she saw, and even what she learned traditionally about the world around her. And she was put down often for her reasons for going into botany and saying, well, that's not scientific enough. You're not approaching it the right way. And she talks about being able to listen to the plants and to outright these things that we know and understand, and yet the scientific world doesn't have a category for those types of understandings. And so her book is about the knowledge she gained scientifically, but how the basis for so much of that knowledge, or even what that knowledge helped demonstrate or prove, was the indigenous wisdom that she grew up with, learning, and even was able to go back to understand things even more deeply. And so I've been reading that book. At the same time, I'm reading this book called Outlive by Peter Attia. And Peter Attia is a doctor. He started out as a surgeon dealing with cancer, and did not like the way medicine was causing him to treat his patients or to treat illnesses. And so he decided to study more about longevity. Now, he's not one of these doctors who is like, this is how you live forever, and this is the science, and this is what you have to eat, and this is the exercise you have to do. But instead, he focused more on not only how, he really talks about how do you live better longer, right? It's almost the same thing with the Move Your DNA book of how do you stay active and healthy and be able to have a wide range of motion and movement well into your 70s, 80s, and 90s, instead of letting our bodies deteriorate, which comes from wearing our heeled shoes and from sitting in our chairs and from doing all the things that we do that our bodies were not designed to do, right? Our bodies were designed to move, not to sit in chairs. And like I said, I really like the book Move Your DNA. I really like the book Outlive. Something I began, as I was reading through Outlive, something I began noticing is he critiques well, I think, medicine and the healthcare industry. And he talks about it, Peter Attia talks about it as medicine 2.0 versus medicine 3.0. And he says, first, the medicine 1.0 was learning that sickness is caused by disease, by germs and things like that. And then medicine 2.0 is learning how to keep clean and how to sterilize and how to even have things like antibiotics. And he talks about how so much of we made these massive advances in our medicine because of understanding things like being sterile and keeping clean and washing our hands and dealing with or having antibiotics and dealing with viruses and all these types of stuff. But he says the bulk of the medical community is not about how to live better. It's merely about how to cure disease. And so one example he gives in his book is the greatest decrease in cancer came not from a treatment we've designed, but from the understanding we've learned about the connection between smoking and cancer. And the number of deaths we prevented merely by encouraging people, teaching people, telling people not to smoke, that has saved so many lives as compared to all the advances in treatments that we've made that actually cures cancer. So he talks about how the healthcare industry is about healing sickness rather than helping to encourage wellness or to encourage living healthy. And so he talks about what he calls medicine 3.0, which is more about living healthy and how to maintain health. And it's not a bad perspective. It's not a bad way to look at it. I actually find myself agreeing with a lot of what he says and what he does. But he talks about study after study after study. He's a doctor. He's a research doctor, and he loves scientific studies. He loves the scientific method. He's very he gets very into what he's doing. He's changed his philosophy several times over the years as he's tried to learn better and understand better, and as he's gained more knowledge and studied new things. And the thing I find as I'm reading his book is that while I like the things he's doing, I don't find what he's talking about necessarily sustainable because of all of the tracking and all of the things that he's doing every day, right? He films every workout that he does so he can critique how he did it, right? He monitors all these things to understand his health and what glucose does to you and what all these other things, and knows almost on a minute by minute or daily basis of what's going on with his body, which again is not a bad thing, but it's not sustainable for so many people. And he's referencing studies, he's critiquing studies over and over and over again. And in the back of my mind, he's also very upfront about what he got wrong when he was younger and what he was into and his understandings then and how it's changed over the years. And now he understands these new things. And so this is really the way to go. And this is a better way to approach it. And so he talks about what he's learned, what he's done right and what he's done wrong, even over the course of his career. But then I think because I'm reading this book, which I don't disagree with the book, and I'm not even knocking the scientific method, but I'm finding it doesn't have the depth that I'm looking for. And so while I'm reading Outlive by Peter Attia, and I'm also reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, I've begun to think about the difference between indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge. Let me just clarify this a little bit. So I Googled this morning, just what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge? I found a very simple article on dictionary.com. And the article is called Wisdom versus Knowledge. What's the difference? Here's a good summary. The primary difference between the two words is that wisdom involves a healthy dose of perspective and the ability to make sound judgments about a subject, while knowledge is simply knowing. Anyone can become knowledgeable about a subject by reading, research, and memorizing facts. Wisdom comes from a much longer range of experiences. I'll share this article so you can read the whole article. Well, another way they describe it even in the articles, it says knowledge is about knowing what to say, knowing the answer to a problem. Wisdom is knowing when to answer. So if knowledge is knowing what to say, wisdom is knowing when to say it. Even if you look at just these synonyms for knowledge versus wisdom, knowledge is about ability, awareness, education, expertise, familiarity, and grasp. Wisdom is about caution, experience, foresight, judgment, and prudence. And it's not that one's necessarily better than the other, or one is worse than the other, but you really need them to coexist. And so in his book, Outlive, Peter Attia is talking about a ton of knowledge, but his wisdom really only goes as deep as his own experiences or even his own life and the stuff that he's done wrong and now he's doing different, so we should do these same things. But part of me, while I'm reading his book, I'm wondering, is this just your latest thing? And in 5 years, you're going to be saying something very, very different. Whereas when I read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she talks about the things she's known or the things she's learned by studying botany. But her study began with an understanding and even wanting to know more fully the stuff that she was taught as a child or that she experienced growing up in a more indigenous way. And so her knowledge is deeply tied and rooted, not just to her wisdom, her short life of experience, but to the wisdom of her elders, to the wisdom of her community, to not just the decades she's been on this earth, but the centuries, the eons that her people have been on this earth, learning and understanding and passing these things down from stories, generation to generation to generation, things that have been tried and tested and found to be true. And so I while they're both useful things, and even in some ways, these books aren't about the same topics, but they lead to they're trying to do a similar thing, which is to change the way we approach the world and the way we live our lives. But I find the wisdom argument and the book that's rooted in wisdom is much more persuasive than the book that's merely rooted in knowledge with a limited amount of experience, a limited amount of wisdom that comes from usually within one's own life. And this is also something I find very interesting, especially about healthy living. right? Which is the 5 a.m. Club, as well as Move Your DNA, as well as Outlive, right? All these books are about how to live healthier. And the last two, as well, I'll add another one in there. I'll add Born to Run, right? Which was another book I've read recently. And all these books are about how to live healthier. And these books frequently go back to, this is how the human body evolved. This is how the human body has lived for hundreds, thousands, even millions of years, right? Long time. And this is how the human body is wrestling, struggling to adapt to the massive changes we've made in the past 100 years. Right? Just one of the points they make in both the Outlive book as well as the Building Your DNA, or Move Your DNA book, which is, right, our bodies were designed to store fat because food was hard to get and it was scarce. Now, for a large part of the world's population today, that's no longer true. Food is no longer hard to get, nor is it scarce. It's not nearly as healthy as it used to be, but it's a lot more abundant. And so our bodies and our genes have not caught up to the vastly different reality we're living in today. And this is why we have such extreme cases of obesity and diabetes and all these things that we're dying of in droves, right? These chronic diseases, heart disease and diabetes and all these other things that come from we are doing things to our bodies that was vastly different than what many people were doing 150, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And those are just, a few hundred years is not even a blink of an eye when you look at evolutionary, the length of evolution. And so a lot of these books talk about, they build their arguments based on, well, this is what our hunter-gatherer ancestors used to do, right? They lived lives where they would go out, they would have to move, they would have to hunt, they'd have to gather, they'd have to farm, they have to do all these, not even farm, they have to pick and scavenge and find things to eat. They'd have to store up, they'd have to eat when there was abundance and live off the fat stores of their bodies when there was not very much. And right, this generally led to a healthier body. Now you go back to the disease, you go back to the viruses, you go back to the things that came from not being very clean, and we had a much lower mortality rate, or a much lower life expectancy back then. But today we're dying because our bodies aren't able to adjust to this new lifestyle we're living. And so they talk a lot about the wisdom and the going back and understanding how our bodies were designed or how they evolved, and going back to kind of this hunter-gatherer mentality of having a wide range of motion and having your food be a reward for exercise instead of a punishment for eating too much, and all these different things. And I'm thinking, and they're going back based on scientific studies. They don't know anybody who lived this way. Right? They don't know anyone. And they've long left their communities that lived at that kind of a subsistence level. But for most native peoples, that wisdom, that lifestyle is only a few generations back. Right? My grandparents, sheep herders. My great-great-great-grandparents, hunters and gatherers, right? That's what we were doing. And so I'm finding that these scientific books are trying to draw on the wisdom of a community and even move back to not necessarily the age of, but to some of the wisdom and the movement that came from when they were hunters and gatherers. But there's no personal relationship with that. There's no stories or experience or understanding of that at any deep level. It's just about what they've read or what they've seen in a magazine article or in a study. Whereas for Native peoples in our oral traditions, these are the stories that we heard, right? These are the stories that we were told growing up and we understood. Find the difference between wisdom versus knowledge. Very similar to the difference between, you've heard me talk about this before, power and authority. Where if knowledge is what you can understand from reading books, and wisdom is what you gain from experience of not just yours, but the experience of others around you, power is the ability to act. And authority is the right of jurisdiction or the permission to act. If knowledge is knowing what the right answer is, but wisdom is knowing when to give that answer, right? That's a huge difference. Same thing between power and authority, right? Power is having the ability to act. Wisdom is knowing, do you have the permission or the right, or even is it prudent to act? And so our modern world is so obsessed with power and knowledge because it has so little ties to authority and wisdom. And so whenever these authors, these scientifically minded people who are largely obsessed with power, tap into a little bit of indigenous wisdom, not even recognizing that's what it is, and then they write their books, right? And they sell hundreds of millions of copies of these books. And as I'm reading this as an indigenous man, I'm like, this is not much different from what you guys tried to beat out of my community just a few decades ago, right? With the boarding schools. I'm not saying the knowledge is bad, but I'm saying it's so much richer when you base it on your wisdom. The United States of America is obsessed with knowledge and power. And it's absent, even impotent, of wisdom and authority. And so when I read books like Braiding Sweetgrass, I really like it because the knowledge that they display in the book is rooted in the indigenous wisdom. And I think these types of books, whether it's Outlive or Move Your DNA or the 5 a.m. Club, right, would be so much richer. Even if they made the exact same points, but they tied them in to indigenous wisdom instead of just briefly mentioning this is what our hunter-gatherer ancestors used to do. Finding this all very interesting and very motivating. I'm very excited about this trajectory I'm on right now. And I realize I'm on a trajectory. I don't quite know where it's going, right? I'm doing the barefoot running. I'm trying to take what I'm learning in these books about knowledge, but I'm trying to root it more deeply in the wisdom of my Native community. And I'm finding when I do that, there's a richness, right? I'm not just jumping on the bandwagon of barefoot running. I'm running as a spiritual discipline. And when my daughters are finally out of school and they're out of the house and I don't need to worry about schedules and getting to school every morning, I'm really looking forward to combining my running and my sunrise watching more frequently. and actually be able to run to the sunrise and be able to do that more. That's coming in the next 2 or 3 years, hopefully. But I'm thrilled about the stuff I'm learning, and I'm looking for a way to move, even to bring these conversations, to root these conversations more deeply in Indigenous wisdom rather than only in scientific knowledge. So anyway, those are my thoughts, my relatives. I highly recommend both these books I'm reading. I haven't finished either of them yet. I'm still reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and I'm still reading Outlive. They're both really good books. I'm grateful to both these authors, and I'm learning a lot as I'm trying to put them together and just make sense of both of them. But they're really good, and I highly recommend both of them. I also want to let you know, coming up next week. Actually, no. So tonight, sorry, on my Patreon tonight, I'm having my Q&A, my monthly Q&A on my Patreon. So once a month on my Patreon, the Ask Questions tier, I do an open Q&A, and people ask questions, whether it's about the books I've written or the things I've said in my second cup of coffee, or things that have come up over the course of my public speaking. And I answer questions, and I let people, I have a discussion and have a Q&A. And that's going to be happening tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, just before the debate. So the debate starts at 9. So the hour before that, I'll be doing this Q&A. I invite you to join it. My Patreon is one of the best ways to encourage and support my work, and on an ongoing basis. I work very hard to keep my voice independent, to not let it be swayed by corporations or by advertising. So I have not monetized my social media, even though you may see ads on my website or on my YouTube videos. You won't. I haven't monetized those, so I'm not making any money off of that. And I do that because I don't want to give advertisers any sway in what I do or do not talk about, what I say or do not say. And so if you would like to support and encourage and help keep my voice independent, if you like what I'm doing with my second cup of coffee and other things, I invite you to subscribe to my Patreon. There are many ways we're taking the conversation deeper there, and tonight is just one way we're doing that with the Q&A tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, next week on July 2nd, on Tuesday, I will be in Newtown, North Dakota, and I will be speaking at the MHA Nation Interpretive Center there as a part of a speaker series called Our Voices Remain, Indigenous Perspectives Along the Lewis and Clark Trail. This is a very similar presentation to the one I gave last month in Nebraska, but it's a speaker series along the Lewis and Clark Trail. And so I'm really looking forward to being in North Dakota next week and giving this presentation again. I still don't know. I haven't heard if this is going to be live streamed or not. There's a chance it may be, but I haven't heard a final answer on that. I'm hopefully we'll hear more about that later today or tomorrow. If you're in North Dakota, the Newtown area, I invite you to come. This is a public presentation. It's open to the public and it's free. And if there is going to be something available online, I'll definitely let you know. So those are some things coming up, my relatives. Again, tomorrow I'll be back for another cup of coffee, and I'll be talking about the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So if you have a chance, watch that tonight. And let me give you the link to my Patreon. I mentioned that earlier. If you want to support my work, be a part of helping me keeping my voice independent, I invite you to join my Patreon. And here is the link where you can do that. So very much great. Thank you for listening today. Jordan, great to see you. Mr. Phil Fox, thanks for being here. George and Elizabeth, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for being here. It's great to have everybody. I hope you have a good day, my relatives. Walk in beauty. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Yá'át'ééh and Hakone.